5 years ago, I did an analysis of the book Heart of Darkness and two of its adaptations. I made these videos during a very difficult time in my life, when I was struggling with my mental well-being and had exhausted a variety of medical interventions. I turned to Heart of Darkness during this time because I perceived similarities between my inner struggle and those of the characters in the book and the adaptations. They, too, were struggling with really dark thoughts that they could not reconcile with, though granted, theirs were murderous and mine weren't. For reasons unknown to me at the time, I felt that by getting a grasp of what the heart was and why it had such possessive power, it would somehow enable me to confront my own inner darkness and prevent it from possessing me, like it did the villains in those stories. After a month of study, I understood that the term Heart of Darkness described the animalistic side of human beings, the side we suppress in order to get along in civilized society. From time to time, dispiriting events will occur in our lives that will make this uncivilized side break free from its shackles and threaten to take over our personality. The greatest heroes are the ones who maintain their morality in the face of this threat, and the greatest villains are the ones who honestly contend with it but choose to give in to that horror. This is why characters like Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, the movie adaptation of Heart of Darkness, are so revered. It's also why characters that are based on him, such as Thanos from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, are elevated as archetypal villains. They seem of sound mind, educated, philosophical, qualities that should enable them to contend with their inner darkness, but they nonetheless fail and become corrupted. They then become convinced that the only way out of their predicament is to give that darkness the expression it craves. Otherwise, it will tear them apart from the inside. For 5 years, I had wondered how many villains had been inspired by the Kurtz character. I wanted to see how consistently the archetypal power of the Kurtz character could carry over to its imitators. But the only official examples I could find were Thanos and Baron Harkonnen from Dune. But this past year, I finally found a new subject, in the character of Caesar from the video game Fallout New Vegas. The lead designer behind this game, Joshua Sawyer, confirmed this connection with the following quote: "Both Caesar and Kurtz are men of intelligence and education who traveled from a life of relative comfort, technological wizardry, and civilization into a wilderness full of warring people with relatively low education and a relatively primitive lifestyle. Both rose to power and were essentially deified for their intelligence, knowledge, and leadership capabilities. Both cut off communication with the outside world and lived in their, until now, remote savage kingdoms, using the most brutal means possible to deal with rare instances of dissent. While most of the pivotal life events are mirrored between the two characters, there is one key difference, one that evolves the Kurtzian archetype. Sawyer notes that where Kurtz's reign over his people was short-lived, Caesar's reign continues for a long, long time. A point of fascination for myself was what might have happened to Kurtz from the novel or the movie if they lived on for several decades. Would they have learned to contend with the madness in their soul? And if so, how? With Caesar, we find one possibility. Caesar is a fascistic dictator who, like Kurtz, is possessed by the Heart of Darkness and rules through brutal force. But unlike Kurtz, Caesar seemingly finds peace of mind, and does so through a patchwork philosophy, one he uses to justify his actions. In order to garner a full appreciation for the terror of that philosophy, it would be useful to review some of the key events from his life. Before he was Caesar, he was known as Edward Sallow. Edward was born in 2226 in an area known as the Boneyard, formerly Los Angeles, California. At the age of 2, Edward and his mother sought shelter after his father was killed by raiders. Thankfully, both of them were taken in by the humanitarian organization known as the Followers of the Apocalypse, an organization that fell under the rule of the New California Republic at the time. As she cooked and cleaned for the followers, Edward learned how to read and started taking courses free of charge. Up until the age of 20, Edward was educated to become an agent for the followers. On their behalf, he would learn the dialects of tribes inhabiting the Utah region, specifically around the Grand Canyon, so they may receive the followers' humanitarian aid. On the way to the canyon, he and his companions discovered a cache of historical texts, two of which made a significant impression on Edward. One was the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and the other was Julius Caesar's book, Commentari de Bello Gallico. He was fascinated with these books, locking himself away for 2 weeks just to study them. Little did he know that the knowledge gleaned from these texts would be soon put to practical use. Prior to arriving at the Grand Canyon, Edward and his team met a Mormon missionary named Joshua Graham, a pre-established expert in tribal languages who would help the followers with their humanitarian mission. Their first encounter with a tribe known as the Blackfoot went less than ideal. The Blackfoot decided to hold them as hostages, an act that Joshua chastised himself for due to a potential mistranslation. Edward found himself in a dangerous situation, but not because he felt threatened by any of the Blackfoot.
The Blackfoot were at war with 7 other tribes, each just as pissant as they were. But outnumbered like that, they weren't going to last long. It's one thing to be taken hostage, another to be lashed to a sinking ship.
Unwilling to go down with said ship, Edward decided to use the military knowledge he gleaned from Caesar's commentary to educate the Blackfoot.
I taught them how to use the guns they already had, how to strip and clean them, how to breathe when pulling a trigger, how to reload ammunition. They looked at me like I was some kind of a sorcerer. So I taught them how to make explosives and started drilling them on small unit tactics.
When the time came for actual combat, Edward started to become as possessed by the spirit of Julius Caesar as he would soon be by the Heart of Darkness. He not only conquered all the other tribes, he did so in brutal fashion. He boasts about killing every man, woman, and child who wouldn't yield to him, displaying their corpses to other tribes in order to force fealty. Edward's justification for these crimes against humanity parallels that of Kurtz. Kurtz had become disillusioned with the US government for their moral hypocrisy, specifically regarding their actions during the Vietnam War. For a time, the US military seemed to covertly endorse Kurtz's brutal military strategies because they were effective. However, when evidence of Kurtz's actions became more or less public knowledge, and he refused to accept less efficient methods, the US military were forced to send an assassin to kill him. With no institutional backing for his methods, and the horrors of war corrupting him, Kurtz's morality became unmoored. This mirrors Edward's dissatisfaction with the New California Republic, the nation he grew up under. He believes that the pre-war culture and government of the US that the NCR was trying to emulate was also filled with moral hypocrisy and inefficiency.
The NCR has all the problems of the ancient Roman Republic. Extreme bureaucracy, corruption, extensive senatorial infighting. Greed runs rampant. The government is corrupt, accepting bribes from Brahmin barons and landowners to the detriment of citizens. The NCR is a loose conglomerate of individuals looking out for themselves. It's lost virtue. No one cares about the collective, the greater good.
This, too, left Edward with an unmoored morality, a fact that was mirrored, interestingly enough, in Caesar's neutral karma status. Quoting Joshua Sawyer once again, "Whatever moral framework he had as Edward Sallow among the followers has disintegrated after years of being Caesar, i.e. it's not so much that his karma is neutral as much as it is alien. Unlike Kurtz, who could only do so much with his loose conglomerate out in the Vietnamese jungle, Edward took maximum advantage of his situation. He had virtually invoked the spirit of Julius Caesar through his actions, assimilating enough of the surrounding tribes into one monolithic culture. Due to this, Edward felt it was only appropriate to change his name to Caesar, and name those he ruled over his legion. From the age of 20 to the age of 48, Caesar had conquered all of Arizona and New Mexico, with holdings in Utah and Colorado. In total, he had conquered 86 tribes. As I alluded to earlier, Kurtz was unlike Caesar because he had a deeper, more profound struggle with the immoral acts that he committed and saw others commit during wartime. Caesar, however, did not. Or if he did, we never saw that struggle. Caesar seemed to be more focused on what he perceived to be a greater threat. With the NCR's growing influence, he predicted a future where they would repeat the patterns that led to not only the downfall of ancient Rome, but that of American culture and government. A downfall that precipitated the global thermonuclear war of 2077. The only way to solve this, in his mind, would be Pax Romana, a, quote, nationalist, imperialist, totalitarian, homogenous culture that obliterates the identity of every group it conquers. And he will complete this goal as soon as he subsumes his most worthy foe, the NCR. He has a number of justifications for this dictatorial regime, but the most famous justification is his incitement of Hegelian Dialectics. When I first announced that I was going to do videos on Fallout New Vegas, this was one of the subjects my viewers clamored for the most. Caesar's invocation of Hegelian Dialectics gives us the deepest insight into not only Caesar's philosophy, but his psychology as well. To give a proper understanding of Hegel, I do need to provide a brief history of a philosophical tradition he belonged to, one known as Idealism. In one sentence, Idealism proposes that our perception of reality is greatly influenced by our mind. It is a philosophy that has a admittedly metaphysical, spiritual bent. One of its earliest precursors, Anaxagoras from ancient Greece, held the belief that all material objects in the universe are and were created by mind. This belief, of course, finds echoes in Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism. But to what extent do ideas in our mind influence our reality? One of the most famous proposals in the idealist tradition comes from Immanuel Kant. He believed that human perception was just as imperfect as every other part of us, which prevents us from having a perfect understanding of reality. In other words, we cannot understand reality and its components in and of themselves, what Kant referred to as the noumena. Instead, we can only formulate imperfect ideas about the noumena, and these imperfect ideas were called phenomena. For example, we create the ideas of time and space in order to perceive space-time. The aforementioned Hegel concurred with this perception to a degree. One of his most famous quotes was that the rational is real and the real is rational. Basically, this means that our rationality produces ideas that help us perceive reality. But Hegel differed from Kant in two major respects. One, Hegel believed that there are certain shared ideas that pre-exist us, ones that we think we create, but instead reveal themselves to us through intuition. These ideas include things like culture, society, well-being, government, religious ideas, symbols, etc. The primary way these ideas manifest is through what Hegel refers to as the spirit. Now, the second thing that Hegel disagreed with Kant about was the belief that the noumena could not be understood. Hegel believed that by having the spirit constantly intermingle with itself through human interaction, our understanding of phenomena will evolve into an understanding of the noumena. This would continue on and on until the end of time, when the spirit reached apotheosis. This process is what Hegel referred to as the dialectic. As for how the process of dialectic goes, I will let Caesar speak.
The fundamental premise is to envision history as a sequence of dialectical conflicts. Each dialectic begins with a proposition, a thesis, which inherently contains or creates its opposite, an antithesis. Thesis and antithesis. The conflict is inevitable, but the resolution of the conflict yields something new, a synthesis, eliminating the flaws in each, leaving behind common elements and ideas.
Applying this to Fallout New Vegas, the spirit of mankind could evolve no further through the NCR, the thesis. Thus, the spirit needed to create an antithesis to oppose it. This spirit first manifested itself through Edward Sallow and evolved into the Legion. Through confrontation, the NCR and Caesar's Legion will let their bad ideas die off and the good ideas remain, producing a synthesis of the two. This is the philosophy that Caesar uses to justify his brutality. Just as Caesar is possessed by the heart of darkness and the spirit of Caesar, he is also possessed by the Hegelian spirit. Now, the Hegelian dialectic provokes its own set of theses and antitheses in my mind. On the positive side, it quasi-validates some of my favorite ideas from the realm of metaphysics and psychology. Obviously, if any of you have been watching my channel for a while, you will have heard me speak about a metaphysical concept known as the union of opposites. Having opposing forces unite to create something greater and even divine is a common idea in Eastern traditions, as well as the Hermetic traditions like Kabbalah and occult magic. Also, the notion that people do not have ideas, but ideas have people is basic psychoanalysis. And Hegel's conception of the spirit as an idea that has people is intriguing. However, like with many of Caesar's ideas, they sound good at first, but fall apart under minimal scrutiny. One of the biggest problems I and others have with the concept of the Hegelian spirit is how it negates human choice. The idea that human beings are the puppets of this spirit manifesting itself throughout history does not seem to allow for human agency. Even if, as psychoanalysis posits, we are the puppets of ideas, is the purpose of consciousness not to choose which ideas are the best, independent of this supposed spirit? Plus, Hegel seems to think that every confrontation between a thesis and antithesis will necessarily produce a superior synthesis, even though fictional and non-fictional events suggest otherwise. I will use one key example from Fallout New Vegas to demonstrate what I mean. As far as we know, Caesar was victorious in every battle he fought, save for one, the first battle of Hoover Dam, where he lost to the NCR. Of the many reasons the Legion lost, the primary one involves their refusal to use long-range weapons and explosives. Though Caesar's Legion is the greatest when it comes to short-range and hand-to-hand combat, they lack the long-range tactical advantage that the NCR has. Here, we see potential for synthesis. Caesar has a point when he states that over-reliance on weapons will weaken the individual. But no matter how hard an individual trains, a legionary with a lance will be no match for a soldier with a sniper rifle. An ideal synthesized soldier would embrace the good points of both sides, but Caesar saw things differently. After losing the Battle of Hoover Dam, he did not learn from his mistakes. He doubled down on his belief that fighting with long-range weapons was dishonorable. Now, some might retort by pointing out that Caesar seems willing to let elements of his culture die out during the dialectic conflict with the NCR.
The NCR Council will be eradicated, but the new synthesis will change the Legion as well.
Granted, but he seems to be awfully selective about when he applies this attitude. Not only that, but how he applies it as well. Who is to say that there needs to be a violent conflict with the NCR for a proper dialectic synthesis? Even if a dialectic takes place, who is to say that Caesar would be willing to let go of his cultural traditions and practices? For example, I have a hard time believing he'd let go of his culture's reliance on slave labor in favor of the NCR's market economies, or let go of the subjugation of women in favor of their employment. This would allow the citizens he controls to gain their own degrees of power, which would inherently threaten his own. The stability of the Legion, up until this point, has relied on keeping his citizens ignorant and slavish, even though this is to his detriment. He suffers from a brain tumor that nobody in his Legion can operate on, due to their lack of medical knowledge or knowledge in general. Ultimately, the invocation of dialectics, though it has a modicum of practical applicability, is mostly just an excuse so that Caesar can satiate his bloodlust. I had put off doing this video for a while. I had feared that by giving somebody like Caesar his due in any regard, some people might think I was justifying the brutality of a dictator. But that's not true. Instead, I'm trying to analyze the common elements between Caesar and others of his ilk, in fiction and real life. That way, we can rebut the arguments of potential dictators before their influence grabs hold of impressionable minds, a la the Hegelian spirit or the Heart of Darkness. The common thread that I see among these villains is a handful of valid criticisms regarding their ideological opponents and/or the state of the world. They then use those valid criticisms to justify extremity, the unleashing of human savagery. Though there are many arguments in favor of their ideological opponents and against themselves, they will be ignored so that they can assert their tyrannical will. Except the thing is, in the case of somebody like Caesar, it's not really his will. It's the will of the ideas that possess him. When I came to this realization with the Kurtz character 5 years ago, I saw how I, too, was controlled by ideas that were not my own. Instead of choosing the path of unconscious bliss where ideas directed my will, I chose the more difficult path, the one that neither Caesar nor the NCR could accomplish. I chose synthesis. Actual synthesis, not Caesar's brand. I dedicated myself to examining all ideas honestly, calmly, and trying to extract the good where possible. Even though there will always be times where I, like Kurtz, feel unmoored, where I anxiously question my worldview, I will always choose the more difficult path of conscious self-reflection, of synthesis. At least with this path, the ideas that control us can die, instead of us. I want to offer my deepest thanks to 3 people. Thank you, Corbin, once again, for encouraging me to do videos on Fallout New Vegas. Thank you, Arcane, for discussing Hegelian Dialectics with me. And finally, thank you to my podcast co-host, Cybsidian, for using his Fallout expertise to help me check my work. By the way, yes, I have a gaming podcast. If you want to check that out, go check out the S podcast channel in the description box below. Make sure to give this video a like if you liked it, that helps me out a lot. If you want to see other Fallout-related content, click on any of the videos you see on screen now. Until next time, remember to stay safe and stay yellow.